Would you like an introduction, Tim?
Not necessary. I can introduce myself.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Well, Justin, thanks a lot. Landy, thanks for inviting me to come here and speak to your group. It's certainly a pleasure. I recognize a lot of the names that are on the chat there. And it's just great to be able to not see your faces, but at least be able to talk to you guys. The topic tonight is controlling Varroa. You know, it's, I guess whenever people hear me speak, usually that's one of the things they hear me speak about, because it's a big fat problem in the beekeeping realm. I'm fortunate enough to have kept bees before Varroa even came into this country, and it was a lot more fun back then. And now, you know, Varroa, it's like every time we think we got it controlled, it kind of changes a little bit, and we're really not in control. One thing I've learned, guys, through many years of beekeeping is that you can't assume anything. Okay, there's no assumptions. You need to be examining and looking and trying to stay one step ahead of a lot of different problems in beekeeping. And Varroa are a big one you need to stay ahead of. As our number one enemy, that's what it looks like. Number one problem in the beekeeping industry worldwide. And, you know, you guys need to take it very seriously. Why be concerned about this parasite? And they'll kill your hives. They'll kill your bees. They increase overwinter death losses. We've seen that through all the overwinter death loss surveys I did when I was the state apiarist. It's just black and white. People would always try to blame something else for killing their bees, but when we investigated it and talked to them about it, we'd find out that there was very little treatment done. There was no monitoring of how effective the treatment was, and there were a lot of treatments used back, you know, 5-10 years ago that really are not effective in any way, shape, or form. These parasites also spread viruses. They slow down your spring buildup. They decrease resistance to pesticide exposure. They reduce honey production and can cause splits and nukes to fail if their levels are too high. Those are the reasons we need to be concerned about this parasite. Detection. It's very important to kind of monitor your levels. Back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we used to talk about finding your threshold level and when you need to treat. And I don't really think that that's true anymore. The main reason to monitor, in my opinion, is so that we know what levels we have prior to a control measure and what your levels are after that control measure is applied. For detection, I only really recommend alcohol wash. Why? Because it's the best. It compares apples to apples and is least likely to be done incorrectly. Many times people would do some of these other tests and they wouldn't really do them correctly, and they would think that they did not have a problem when in fact they had a big problem. They just couldn't see it because of the method they chose was not effective. When should the detection be done? You know, monthly after June and before treatment to determine what your levels are. And then I recently learned this listening to a Randy Oliver presentation. I used to always tell people retest 2 weeks after treatment to determine what your effect was. But Randy said 21 days after treatment. And I thought that was smart. I asked him about it on that presentation, and he said, well, that's a full brood cycle. So that way, if you put a control measure on and it was not you can better gauge how effective it was by what your mite level is 21 days after that treatment was completed. If you want to know how to do an alcohol wash, maybe you're a relatively new beekeeper and you've never seen it before. I did a video at Landy's place, and I did a video with Kevin England on how to do an alcohol wash. They're like 6 or 7 minutes long, and they're on YouTube. You can Google search them, Tim Schuler alcohol wash. You should be able to find that. and it explains why we do what we do when we're doing an alcohol wash. So John Gott shared me this graph, and it just kind of shows bee and mite population. All right, here's our bees as they start up in January. You can see the bee population explodes in spring, lots of pollen and nectar coming in, and then once we get past the major honey flow, it starts to trail off. Now the mite levels, if they're low early in the season, you can see that they are growing, but they're very low here, and then they kind of mirror maybe a month behind the growth of the honeybees, and they're all the way up, and those populations get extremely high, especially when we get into July and August. So simplified mite population growth. This is another one that shows the fact that the mite population increases over 50% every 2 weeks in April, May, and June. So as colonies are brooding up, your mite population is expanding. Many times, guys, I would hear people say to me, well, Tim, this hive was my best producer. This was great all year long, all season long, but yet it's dead in September, October. And why is that? That's because the strongest colonies that are producing the most brood are also allowing Varroa to reproduce the most. As that brood production ramps up, Varroa production is ramping up. And it's very important that you keep on top of that. People would say to me, I don't have them. And I'm going to tell you, everyone has Varroa to one degree or another. People used to say years ago, oh, swarms, they leave all the Varroa back at the parent colony. Don't believe that for a minute. Swarms have them. First-year packages can have them, and they can have high levels. Nukes can have them. You usually won't see them on adult bees till it's too late. So if you think you don't have Varroa, I would say that you're mistaken, that you have them. You just either aren't looking for them or they're below a detectable level at this particular time. For those of you that have never seen Varroa, they kind of get up under these abdominal scales and they suck the blood. Usually they're on the belly side, not so much on the back side of the bee. Here's a drone that's been heavily parasitized while it was pupating. You can see the little nymphs here and the adult bee. The adult mite. And this drone is not the normal sized drone. These two bees are examples of bees that have deformed wing virus. You can see that their wings are shriveled. They look like strings. Those bees will never really do anything to help the hive. You can sometimes see them on there, but by all means, alcohol wash is your best method to determine your infestation and try to quantify how infested your colony is. There were times that we've tested different mite treatments using sticky boards. If someone doesn't have a good eye, they might look at that and just think it's hive debris. But you can see these are all mites in this circle. And if you look across this board, there's Varroa everywhere. They're all over the place. Heavy infestation. They show up real good on nice white pupa. This colony, if you've ever heard me speak about this subject before, you'll know that at least this colony here was a swarm that had been in an empty box. It flew into a beekeeper in Pennsauken, New Jersey's empty box and had been there for about a month before I went to inspect it. And I was shocked at how many Varroa were in here. You can even see them on the other side of the wax cells, and they're just loaded. And this was a swarm in early spring. Okay. Another great place that I always would keep my eye on is when you break apart your multiple story hives. If there's burr comb in between the boxes, you'll see Varroa on there Very, very obvious. Just take a quick look. You'll see them moving, and they stand out like a sore thumb on a light-colored pupa. For those of you that never did an alcohol wash, these are your key pieces of equipment. You have a wash tub. Just makes it easy to collect bees and knock them to one side of the tub. Here's an alcohol washer. Some clubs have bought them. Grant Styles usually has them in stock. There's people that have imported them from Canada because that's where they're made. And this is two jars and two lids welded together with a piece of hardware cloth in between. And this is a quarter cup measuring cup. You want to put about a half a cup of bees into your washer and wash them hard for about 30, 40 seconds. Okay, that's kind of how you would do an alcohol wash. Best places to really see it is to look at that video I was telling you about. Who do you want to test? You know, adults of bees off of open brood. So you want to make sure there's open brood on your frame. You want to make sure the queen's not on the frame. And a good way to deal with that is if there's a lot of bees on a frame, I would typically give it a little shake and shake some of those bees back into the box, because then it's a lot easier to see the queen if there's not a million bees all like layered up on the frame. And then I would just go ahead and shake that frame into the wash tub, scoop up a half cup, wash them for about 30 seconds, and divide the number of mites by 3, and that'll give you a percentage if you want to go with percentages. And just keep track of those levels so you know what's going on. What's acceptable? Everyone I ask has a different opinion, and those opinions have changed over time. I mean, I remember a dear lady beekeeper who had her threshold, and the problem is if you have one colony in the apiary that is above the threshold and other colonies that are right at the threshold or slightly below the threshold, are you going to treat everybody the same, or are you going to treat each individual colonies differently? And I prefer to treat the whole apiary the same, because if there's a problem in one colony, that problem is also in the other ones. It just maybe not be as high of a level on that particular day. You guys have heard John Gott speak before. You know that John washes every colony in an apiary. And I was on a presentation that Randy Oliver did for the South Jersey Beekeepers, and him and his boys wash every colony in their operation, which is like 1,500 colonies a year, because he made an interesting statement, and I didn't put it in these slides, but he said that 75% of the Varroa mites in his operation are only in 25% of the hives. 75% of the Varroa mites are in 25% of the hives. And I thought that was very interesting. I'd never heard it put that way before. And, you know, that tells me that if you're just alcohol washing, you know, 2 or 3 colonies in an apiary of 20, you're not really getting a good idea of what's going on. So taking the time to wash more of your colonies is a very good thing to do, because you can have these bombs in your own apiary. By bombs, I mean colonies that have high levels, and you would not pick them up just alcohol washing a few colonies in the apiary, and they could be the ones that are collapsing and reinfesting the ones that you've already done good mite control on. So it's something to consider. I know it's a time drain, but it's something that may be beneficial to you to really kind of clean up your apiaries. What level is acceptable? Everyone's got a different opinion. Pretty much 0. If I get 0 out of 100, 0 mites out of 100 bees, I feel pretty good. 1 to 2 per 100, I want to do something about it. 10 or more, the colony's in big trouble. Okay, and I highlighted this here. You do not want the mite population to get ahead of you, because once it gets ahead of you, it's very difficult to rein it back in and pull it back under control. It takes a lot of effort. And ideally, you'll keep your mite levels below detectable levels if possible. Okay, and I'll cover that a little bit more further down through this presentation. This was a guy I read an article he wrote in Bee Culture back in 2015, and he was talking about experienced beekeepers. These are guys that were keeping 400 or 500 colonies, and southern beekeepers, and they were like, we don't have Varroa mites. They swore they didn't have Varroa mites, and they lost 70 to 80% of their colonies. And the only way he could convince them that it was Varroa was he brought his dissecting microscope out and showed them Varroa in the dead pupil cells and on the bottom board. Otherwise, they wouldn't believe him. I've learned through many years of beekeeping that you can't assume anything, and you've got to be vigilant about everything if you want to stay profitable, and if you want to do a good job keeping your bees. Randy Oliver said why, and this was a great one. This was at a New Jersey State Beekeepers meeting up in Hunterdon County that the Northwest chapter sponsored. And Randy said, why is it that if a person doesn't treat a dog with mange, they are considered inhumane, but if they don't treat their bees for a controllable parasitic infection, they're not considered inhumane? And that's a great question. That's a great question. People think that not treating bees is some kind of good for the environment way to go, and I would disagree with that very strongly. So people tell me, this was another thing, people tell me they got into beekeeping to quote unquote save the bees. There was even a college in New Jersey who had a bee club called Save, because they were going to save the bees. But in fact, they were killing the bees because they refused to treat their colonies. And they also were spreading this problem to their neighbors as their colonies collapsed. And in fact, they were wasting a significant amount of money every year buying new bees to replace the ones that they killed the year before. Varroa, you won't find them if you don't look for them. Everyone should treat. Once a year is not enough. Sometimes people think, they took a beginner beekeeping class 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and they think treating once a year is adequate. It's not true. You need to check mite levels before and 21 days after a treatment, and you must understand the proper use of each treatment. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox that we can use to help control this parasite. And it will behoove you to understand the parameters that each of those treatments requires in order to be effective, and to monitor your levels so you know if what you did was effective, and in order to make good decisions about what you can use to control this parasite during what phases of your management cycle for the year. So very important for you to have a good understanding of these different mite treatments. These are all effective to one degree or another. But I think a lot of beekeepers think that every mite treatment, if it's sold in a bee supply catalog as a mite treatment, that they're all equally effective as any other one. And that is not true at all. Okay, they all have differing degrees of effectiveness. And we've seen that to some degree with Apivar in the last few years. We've seen that its effectiveness or its reliability is not what it once was when it first came out. And I would say that it's kind of the same thing with most of these other treatments. Okay, Apiguard, Mite Away Quick Strip, or Formic Pro, Apilife VAR, Apivar, in the past was most effective in my experience. Hopguard, most effective when no brood was in the colony. Oxalic Acid, same thing, really effective with no brood. But they are not all equally effective. Okay, they're tools that need to be used when appropriate, and they need to be used primarily for resistance management. When I was a state apiarist, one of the commercial beekeepers had asked me gave me 40 of his colonies and said, look, I want you to use every mite treatment there is and tell me which are the best ones for me to use for the mites that are in my operation. And I did that. And he told me when Apivar, back then, Apivar, man, we just cleaned the mites up like you wouldn't believe. And he said to me, he says, you saved my business. Okay. Because knowing that and investing the money in the Apivar treatment was very helpful to his business. And for years, those bees looked way better than they ever did. And than anybody else's did. Why? Because the parasites weren't sucking the life out of them and spreading viruses. So keeping these treatments viable and effective for as long as we can is very, very important. I remember the days, guys, back when we had no Varroa, and then we would put Apistan strips in once a year and wipe out whatever Varroa had accumulated in our colonies. And that was great. I mean, it cost a little more, but it was a way to control this parasite. And let me tell you, back then there was only one treatment, and it wasn't that long after we started using that the Varroa became resistant to Apistan, and all of a sudden colonies were in dismal shape after that, and everybody was scrambling. So we want to keep these things as available or as viable as possible for as long as possible. And that's why you need to use different mite treatments throughout the same season to control mites that were not killed by the previous mite treatment that you used. I hope that makes sense to you, and I hope I explained it to you adequately. This is Apiguard. Apiguard is a thymol gel, 250-gram doses, costs about $10 a hive, but this is the thing you got to know. And here's another thing, you know, people talk about the cost of mite treatments. I'm going to tell you right now, I've had this discussion with some of the commercial guys that I worked with, and quite frankly, replacing a colony is more expensive than any of these mite treatments. So keeping those colonies at mite levels as low as possible so they remain productive and viable for you, it really doesn't matter what it costs, because replacing them is very, very expensive. Way more expensive than $10 a hive. Okay. This the Apivar, this thymol gel. The temperature needs to be less than, the label says 105. It really ought to be less than 100 degrees. But the thing is that during the dog days of summer, this is a viable treatment. Okay. Your honey must be moved off or harvested. You need a spacer so the bees have access to material, because what they do is they track it around the hive, and that kind of disperses it within the colony. Screen bottoms must be closed, and as always, check your levels before and about 21 days after to see what the effect was. And I won't deny it, just because it's a soft, quote unquote, soft treatment, it can be hard on the bees. Okay, it can be hard on the bees. This is Formic Acid, comes in a couple different formulations. Now maybe just Formic Pro. But this is 2 strips per pack, one hive treatment, place in the brood nest. Bees don't like it. They'll run right away from it. Can cause nurse and drone death. Really, the temperature needs to be less than 80 degrees. Costs about that. Bottom's got to be closed, safe with honey. And that's what you need to keep in your mind. It's safe to use this with honey. Can be very hard on the bees, though. And in order to deal with that, some beekeepers would freeze those pads and put them on cold, put them on at the end of the day, keep a close eye on the weather. And if there's going to be rain for 2 or 3 or 4 days, you want to put them on then before the rain. And actually, if there's tall grass out in front of the colonies, it will burn the grass right off. This slide here, you couldn't see those frames before I put that on, minutes before I took the picture. And once I put that on, it pushed the bees right down in the colony. So they don't like it. They move away from it, but it will kill Varroa. And the label says it will kill Varroa in the brood cells. Okay, so a viable option. Some people might put 1 strip in, and then a week or 2 later put the other strip in. Some people, like my friend John, he'll go ahead and just put both strips in. He looks for cloudy days during the summertime when the temperature is cooler. Okay, here's some bearding. This colony had the mite away for the formic acid put on it, and half the bees are sitting out on a landing board. Okay, Formic Pro has a different carrier that allows it to vaporize off slower than the Mite Away Quick Strip did. And that's pretty much what I think most people are using now, if they're using formic acid. These are the two options. This is the temperature range, and you guys need to have a little chart or know this stuff so you can make good decisions about when to apply it. The other thing you got to keep in mind is you got to use personal protective equipment. You don't want to breathe this stuff in your lungs. You don't want to touch it with your bare hands, okay, because it will irritate your skin and could even partially burn your skin. So keep those things in mind. Apivar was another treatment that had a solid wafer in here. You'd break it into 3 or 4 pieces, put it in your colony. The temperature range, you got to remove it 30 days before your honey flow, and this one requires 3 treatments 10 days apart. Not something that like a commercial guy would probably use, but it's a very viable treatment that someone in their backyard could use on a relatively small number of colonies. The screen, if you use screen bottom, it's got to be closed. There, that's about it out on that. So these soft chemicals that they would call them are all temperature dependent. They all require the screens. If you use screens to be closed, they are Apilife and Apiguard require the honey to be off. All 3 can shut down brood production. All 3 can kill bees and brood. You just have to be careful and watch the weather. Okay. Apivar was new back in 2013, 2014. I don't know why it did that. 1 strip for 5 frames of bees, not 5 frames of brood, but 5 frames of bees. Honey supers need to be not on. There is no temperature variable for them. 6-week treatment time. The label says 4 to 6 weeks. I would always recommend you leave them on for the longest period of time. And it's got to be removed 10 days before the honey supers are added. It might even be more than $12 a hive. Don't save open packages. That's a common mistake people make. I see posting on Facebook where someone will treat their colonies and have 2 or 3 strips left, and they have fresh strips. That's a great idea to try to use or share them with one of your bee buddies, okay? But I used to have people save them from 1 year to the next, and that's just as if there's no effectiveness in there. Once that package is open, all the active ingredient will be out in about 60 days. So don't save them from 1 year to the next. Was highly effective, but we've been getting some mixed results in the last couple years. Some users did not get good results. Some resistance testing shows some degree of resistance in some Varroa populations. In other instances, poor performance of Apivar when you test those bees or those mites shows no resistance. So sometimes the poor performance could be due to user error. Sometimes it may be due to some slight resistance developing in the Varroa population. Common problems is, like I even had somebody since I retired told me that Apivar didn't work, and I went to look at their colonies because they live close to me, and they put the Apivar strips near the end bars of the frame. So the cluster of bees wasn't even touching the strip. And I said, you know that. I've told you that countless times. The strip has to touch adult bees or it's not going to work. And sometimes you need to, the beekeeper places them poorly or they don't reposition them as the cluster moves. Sometimes people use old strips like I just told you a minute ago. Sometimes in some areas, bees will propolize the strips, and they actually need to be scraped with your hive tool halfway through the treatment time to release more active ingredient. And sometimes people don't put enough strips in. I had a commercial guy who was always, only putting one strip for 10 frames of bees. And I'm like, yeah, it's expensive, but if you're not applying it correctly, you are not going to get good results. And finally, he got it through his head, and I heard that the last year they used the correct dosage. So it's so important, guys, to read the label and to not just ask your friends and ask Facebook and ask Google, but read the label and follow the directions. And as I've spoken with some of the representatives, if you have a couple extra strips left over, they would say you're better off putting them in a colony and giving them a stronger dose rather than giving a colony a weaker dose. So things for you to consider. Oxalic acid, I hear a lot of people talk about this. A lot of people have different ideas about how to use it. Works best when the colony's broodless. Okay, 2 methods of application: dribble, where the oxalic acid is dissolved in sugar syrup and sprayed between the frames. Okay, and that really works good for a swarm. That works good for mating nukes that are small numbers of bees. In my opinion, wet bees, especially in the fall, are just not that great. But in the spring, if you're treating nukes or swarms, I think it's just fine. The other method of application is vaporization, and the temperature is important. If the colony's too cold or the cluster's too tight, it won't penetrate the cluster and put the oxalic acid where the mites are. It really works best if the colony is broodless, because then there are no mites hiding in brood that are not going to get touched by the vapor. Personal protective gear is very important. And the problem with oxalic acid is you really have to do some other kind of treatment to get them to the point where oxalic acid is effective. Because if you don't treat your colonies well before November, you're never going to make it till December. That colony needs some kind of treatment put on to get those mite levels down. And I really think oxalic acid vaporization is best used as a cleanup in the late fall, so that that colony coming out of the winter is not going to have a mite load on it, and it'll give you much more time for that colony to brood up and not have the mites increase as rapidly as they might otherwise. And the cost on that is really pennies. But I can't stress how important personal protective gear is. You do not want to breathe the fumes of vaporized oxalic acid. You don't want to breathe them. You don't want them touching your eye. So when I was using it on a large scale, helping some beekeepers out, I had a full respirator on, gloves on, and it was kind of claustrophobic working like that. But we knocked a heck of a lot of mites out of that operation using it. This is one of the ProVap guns. You can see there's one working on the other side. There's some vapor coming out right in the entrance, and it really knocked the mites hard. Same here, ProVap. There's the oxalic acid. And you can move pretty quick through a commercial operation with one of these, or with actually 3 or 4 of these running off of generators. So, what does it mean when a colony is washing zeros? Well, a friend of mine said to me, Tim, there's 3 good #1 colonies washing zeros. I want to know how many mites are still in those colonies. So we killed the colonies, shook them all out into a bucket of alcohol, killed them, and then alcohol washed 5 pounds of bees or more. And there's a significant amount of mites still left in a colony, even though you're washing zeros. Okay, this colony was a strong colony, treated with oxalic acid vaporization twice, washing 0 mites. How many are still in a strong colony that washes zeros? And let me tell you, I counted 200 to 300 Varroa in that hive. I did it 3 different times, and it varied anywhere from 200 to 300 Varroa in colonies that are washing 0 after 2 oxalic acid treatments, about 2 weeks apart. Or no, this was only a week apart. Okay, so there's still a residual amount of Varroa left in our colonies in the spring, and that's why it's so important to be on top of your buildup of your bees and your buildup of your Varroa. Mite control strategies, Apivar used to do a great job. When I first started using it, I had been used to using Apiguard and Formic Acid, and every spring I would see Varroa in the Burr comb in my colonies. Once I started using Apivar, I saw no Varroa in the Burr comb in my colonies in the spring, and I used it for the bulk of my Varroa control. Then started hearing rumors of resistance in different places. In large part, that was because a lot of commercial beekeepers were using a homemade recipe kind of off-label. But was it really resistance, or was it beekeeper error? I'm not really sure. 2018 to 2020, we were getting inconsistent results with Apivar. It was not performing the way it did when it first got released. That's why I say that for your strategy, you need to use as many treatments as you can, considering temperature and management over the course of the bee season. For example, in January, February, you may drop an Apivar strip in your cluster on a warm day when they're loosened up. And then come spring, after you get them building up some and it's not too warm out, you might even hit them with Formic Acid to knock the mite level back. Okay, then after you pull your honey crop, you can hit them with something in the heat of the summer like Apiguard. And then as we get into the fall, reuse Apivar. Not in the fall, I should say, more like September, October. Use something like Apivar because it gives resistance, or it gives protection over an 8-week time period. And that's the time when mite bombs are coming back into your colonies. Excuse me. When people or feral colonies die out, or managed colonies that really didn't have a good beekeeper keeping those mite levels low, when they fail, one of the things those colonies will do is abscond and drift into other colonies within a 2 to 3 mile radius of your apiary, and they bring the Varroa with them. So I like having Apivar in during that time period because it provides sustained protection. And then the last thing would be to hit them with something like oxalic acid vaporization, or even something like Apiguard as the colony goes broodless and prepares for the winter. So that way you can use multiple treatments to help prevent resistance from developing over the course of your beekeeper season, taking into account temperature and your management style, like when your honey's off and things like that, to try to keep your colonies, keep your mite levels as undetectable as possible. I would always recommend split snooks packages. Treat them with Apivar or oxalic acid dribble when you make them up, and check 21 days after treatment for what your levels are. 21 days after. Although, as I think about that, if the colony's broodless, you really don't have to wait 21 days. You could recheck a week or two later, to be honest with you. Just some other strategies: less than 1 per 100 bees. Consider using Formic Pro in mid-September, or oxalic acid or Apiguard in November, and help to prevent resistance. There's that whole thing about Apivar strip in January in the brood nest. And bottom line, keep your mite levels undetectable. So take home message, guys, is monitor your levels, treat with multiple treatments to prevent resistance, monitor to see what your effects are, don't make assumptions, and don't let your mite levels get too high. Okay? People will say to me, Tim, if I'm going to treat anyway, why should I monitor what my mite levels are? And it's so important to know what your levels are before and after a mite control, so you know if that had any positive effect on your mite levels or not. And without the information from before and after, you have no way of making that judgment. So it's extra work, but it's well worth doing. And that's pretty much it.
Tim, you've got 3 questions so far that I see in the chat. The first one is, how do you move the Apivar around the hive with the cluster when it is so cold outside? Is opening the hive in the middle of winter detrimental?
Is opening the hive, but what you mean by opening the hive is opening the lid and taking the inner cover off is not detrimental in the winter. I do it all the time. Pulling apart frames when the bees are clustered is very detrimental, and I would not recommend you doing that. If your colony is in the upper box, like they usually are this time of year, you can pop the inner cover and you can see if the cluster is near your Apivar strip or not. And if it's not, you can reposition the strip. It doesn't take long to do it, and you can put your inner cover and outer cover right back on. I would not do any of it without having a lit smoker, just in case they are, just in case the bees are more active than you thought they might be.
The next question is, how many times should oxalic acid be applied, particularly in the fall after the colony is broodless? Is there a difference in the number of recommended applications depending on whether the method is dribble or vaporization?
I'm not sure. I believe the dribble versus vaporization I'm not positive on, but I'll tell you my gut feeling. Medhat Nasser, who was a provincial apiarist from Alberta, Canada, and he was also in New Jersey at one time, did a lot of work with this and did a lot of work with me 2 years ago to try to measure if there was resistance in some commercial operations in New Jersey. And he told me that I should not use oxalic acid vapor more than twice. It's hard on the bees. It can damage their antenna and it can damage their wings. So when the colony's broodless and there's not more bees coming on, you wouldn't want to do it more than 2 times. My gut feeling is I wouldn't want to do dribble more than 2 times. I would want my levels as low as possible using other methods, and then use the oxalic acid as a cleanup towards the end of the year, as opposed to, you know, the whole thing you read about people doing it once a week for 5 weeks. I wouldn't recommend that at all. No. Did that fully answer it, Justin?
I think it just about did there.
Was there a second part to that question? There was a second part that I missed?
I don't think so, but he can, if he wants to follow
No,
up.
that answered my question, Tim. Thank you. I have another one come down. I thought of another one too, but you'll get to it.
Okay.
The next question is actually from Landy. Have you tested the latest formulation of Hopguard? And if so, what do you think? The earlier versions were not very effective, even broodless.
Yeah. I have not tested the latest formulation, Landy. I did test some of the older formulations when I was the state apiarist, but the colonies were not broodless when it was put in. And I assume, once again, I'm making an assumption, and what do I say to you? Don't make assumptions. but I was assuming that if the colony was broodless, it would have been more effective than it was when I used it in colonies that still had brood. So I can't really answer that, but that would be a good little study for somebody to do, to try to compare it when the colony is broodless. Okay, so yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I've heard
Sure.
that the latest version is better than the old version, but I haven't tried it yet, so I don't have any direct experience with it.
Yeah, I haven't tried it either. So, I mean, that one, I'm out. I've been out of that game for the last year, so I don't know. What's the next one, Justin?
If you are treating with Apivar in the fall, would you recommend using oxalic acid at the same time?
Well, I would recommend you use your Apivar in September, October, and then follow up with oxalic acid vaporization once you get closer to Thanksgiving, when the colony is most likely to be broodless, and use it as a cleanup. I don't know that I would use oxalic acid vaporization in September because there's still a lot of brood and a lot of colonies in September. I think you'd be wasting your time, and you'd be using one of your two uses of oxalic acid vaporization, so you don't overhit the bees with it.
Okay, that was my question.
You'd be using it at a time when it would not be as effective as it would be if you waited till the colony was broodless.
Yeah, that was my question also. Although I had brood in some of my colonies, I had brood well into November. I don't know how they were doing it, but they did.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. Not uncommon. That's why I say Thanksgiving is a good time frame. And there can even still be some brood during at Thanksgiving time, depending on where you are in New Jersey, and how strong your colonies are and what kind of incoming food there is. But there's a lot less brood then than there is in September.
Tim, what do you do with a colony that has more than 10% mite level? You mentioned the hive is now doomed. What do you do with it?
Well, what I would do with it is I would treat it, because some of them make it through, but a lot of them are dead men walking. So I would still treat it, number one, because if I don't treat it and it collapses, it's going to spread mites to my other colonies or my neighbors' colonies. So it's really the responsible thing to do. And yeah, does it break my heart to put two $10 Apivar strips in a colony that I know is not going to make it? It does, but at least I'm killing the mites, what I can, off of them before it collapses, and maybe it won't collapse. It takes a lot of experience and a lot of judgment to try to make that decision. And I always erred on the side of trying to keep the parasite levels as low as possible, so I'm not impacting my neighbors and my other colonies.
We seem to be getting hotter summers. Would you be willing to treat with formic acid earlier, i.e. in May or June instead of July?
Yes, and I have done May and June with formic acid, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I try not to do it too early in May. I want the colony to be at least a full box of bees, full deep, 10 frame deep of bees before I would put that treatment on. But I like that idea because it's safe for use with honey supers. Even if you had a honey super on, I've applied it during blueberry pollination on top of a full box of bees, and it knocks the mites down pretty good, and the temperatures are not bad then, so there's very little damage to the bees.
If I vacuum seal Apivar immediately after opening the package, would it still be effective several months later?
The company will say no, and I follow what they say because they write the label. And I know that open package, I mean, people have asked me this question countless times, Jim. If I put them in the freezer, if I suck all the air out using my food sealer, you know, the company, they don't make any guarantees about any of it. And I would much rather see you spread that out into your other colonies or sell it to a friend as long as it's fresh, rather than try to save it like you're talking about, because, you know, you just can't count on it. And that's making an assumption. And I wouldn't make assumptions about stuff like that.
Seems to be a trend lately of applying Apivar in February. Why is this advantageous versus late summer after pulling honey?
Applying Apivar, I would recommend not so much February, but more like January, maybe early February. And that is because there's still relatively little brood in the colony, and it knocks down mites. For example, the population of adult bees is lowest in January, February, and that is when there might only be 5 frames of bees. So you could treat a whole colony with 1 strip rather than 4 strips in September, because it's a full double deep, 20 frames of bees. So it's a way to use Apivar and save some money at a strategic time in the year. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My computer started going to sleep, Justin. That's why everything went blank for a minute. But I'm back.
No, you're all good.
Yeah. So that's why people do it then, because there's very little brood for the mites to hide in, and that's why we started trying to do it that time of year. But I still, even if you did it then, I still like the idea of Apivar to protect the colony from mite bombs coming in from other colonies that are collapsing in the September-October timeframe. That's a very vulnerable time for colonies. I mean, beekeepers will get them cleaned up, and then collapsing colonies reinfect them, and you're like, man, my levels are higher now than they were back in September. So that's why people do it.
Joe asked, I would think that if there were a high mite load in a colony, treating with formic acid would be best, as it also penetrates the brood cappings. What do you think?
I wouldn't disagree with what Joe says. Although I know that the company says it kills mites under the brood cap, but I've seen mites come out of the brood cap after being treated with formic acid. So I'm not, formic acid is very dependent upon temperature and humidity. If it's too high a temperature, it vaporizes off too quickly and may not do as well a job. The humidity can have an effect on it. I'm not against it as long as the weather would allow it. Okay, if the daytime temperatures are too high, then I would be cautious about using it because you can damage the bees.
I think that's it, Tim. I don't see if anyone else has a question. Please post it now. I'm not seeing anything else, Tim. Is there? Would you like to discuss anything else?
I'd like to just thank everybody for coming to listen to this. I hope it's helpful to them, and I certainly hope you guys have a great bee season. I don't know about you, but I am kind of chomping at the bit to get things going here. I see my bulbs my daffodil bulbs are probably 4 inches out of the ground, even though I got snow around here. My wife's friend was grooming her horse tonight, and it was shedding out like crazy. And I'm thinking to myself, man, does that mean spring's coming soon? Like I'm ready to see some maples swell up and get ready to pop, you know.
Well,
So,
I think
Tim, we've got like 2 feet of snow on the ground up here.
Oh,
You
man.
South Jersey guys have got it made in the shade. You have no idea how much snow there is up here. It's crazy.
Yeah, but they're calling for a lot of snow for the next 4 days. Like tomorrow's going to be good, but we're supposed to get snow every day through the weekend, I think.
Yeah, we are too.
You can feel our pain.
Yeah, because where do you put it if you have 2 feet already? Where are you going to put the rest?
That's becoming a real issue. Oh,
Tim, I
man.
think I speak for everyone at our chapter when I say thank you for coming and presenting to us. You know, you're always welcome, and it's great to have you and hear from you.
Yeah, and if you guys wouldn't mind keeping me on your list, I kind of like to snoop in and listen to other presenters when you have other meetings, you know?
We are, as long as we are online, it is free to everyone, and that goes for, you're always welcome to share this link out and post on social media and anything you'd like to do. This is totally open while we're dealing with a pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Tim.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody that came. Have a good evening.
Justin, thank you for hosting this as usual.
Anytime, Charlie. Anytime. Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night, all.